On the outskirts of the old city, where the asphalt creaks underfoot with age and neglect, the sky was grey in the morning, like a tightly curtained window. The air was strangely heavy, with a hint of foreboding. Everything seemed to be waiting for something big and ominous. People were gathering for the annual Unity Festival, an event meant to symbolize reconciliation, but in reality, a patched-up curtain over deep, unhealed cracks. White tents, lined up in a strict line, fluttered proudly against the dilapidated buildings, like a mockery of a past that was still spoken of in whispers here. Music was playing, too cheerful for this morning. The smell of caramel, corn tortillas, and cheap tobacco hung in the air. Children's laughter broke through the hubbub of voices, but it was as fragile as china on the edge of a table. On a stage festooned with faded flags, local officials in bright jackets and practiced smiles delivered speeches about overcoming, mutual understanding, a new day. The words skimmed the crowd's surface without penetrating. No one was really listening. Everyone knew that these speeches were repeated year after year, like a fragile incantation designed to hold back an ancient, suffocating beast called feud. The white part of the audience, mostly officials, volunteers, sponsors, and security, stood in groups, talking among themselves, checking their watches, checking their tablets. Their smiles were forced, their gazes distant. They had come to show their faces. The black part, families, veterans, old people, young people from neighboring neighborhoods, stood closer to the stage or apart at the edge of the fair, sticking together, as if even at this festivity one had to be on guard. There was an invisible line between them, unmarked but palpable, like a cold wind on hot asphalt. Neither tents nor balloons nor speeches could erase that line. Guards stood around the perimeter, in grey uniforms, with bored expressions, some with dark glasses, as if hiding not from the sun, but from their own conscience. There was one among them, especially still, tall, white, with a square jaw and hands clasped behind his back. His face was a frozen grimace of indifference, but his eyes slid over the crowd, as if searching for something, or someone. His name was Rick, a former Marine, now a contractor. He didn't like the job, but he didn't hate it either. It gave him a sense of power, and on this day, in this crowd, he felt he would need power. The crowd was growing. Some were handing out brochures with the words, "We are one." Others were handing out ice cream to children, and others were simply standing with their arms folded across their chests. People were exchanging glances, not with interest, but with apprehension, as if they knew that there was something false about this holiday. In every decorated corner, there was a false shine, behind which hid an unspoken, humming darkness, as if there was a thread hanging in the air that could not be pulled taut, otherwise it would break. Then she appeared, from the depths of the street, to the clanking of horseshoes and the rustling of the evening wind. An elderly black woman rode into the square on a large greying horse. Silence instantly arose around her, not complete, but thick, like a shadow creeping along the walls. Her name was Mabel James. She was in her 70s, and every step of her horse was a callback to the long-gone days when she, as a young woman, had marched in columns at rallies in Selma and Birmingham. People had watched then too. They had been silent then too. There had been those who stood with flags and those with clubs. She wore a long blue dress with a wide hat and held her back straight, as if she were wearing history rather than years. Two girls walked next to her, her granddaughters, little, in white dresses, with black bows and serious eyes. One held a sign, "Justice never rests." The other held a small flag with a fist in a circle. They walked quietly, but their presence pierced everything around them, like a needle through silk. The crowd parted. Someone started filming on a phone. Someone began to whisper. Mabel was not looking for attention. She was simply walking, as always. But her appearance was a challenge, not a protest, not a demonstration, but a reminder of pain, of duty, of not having forgotten everything. And that was what Rick felt. He saw her from afar, and his body tensed. He didn't know her personally, but he knew her type. Pride without reason, ostentatious dignity. He thought such people dangerous, not because they did anything, but because they reminded him and others of something deep, uncomfortable, of guilt, of debts that could not be paid. He moved forward, slowly but decisively. People parted. Someone already sensed that something was wrong. The stage froze. The announcer lost his lines. Mabel stopped her horse right at the entrance to the central arch, where the sign hung, "Welcome to the future." And then, between the loudspeaker, which gave a hoarse glitch, and the clink of a broken bottle near the trash can, the first order sounded, "Dismount, immediately." Rick's voice was cold and hard. People turned around. The girls in white dresses froze, clinging to their grandmother's legs. Mabel didn't move. She just looked at him, long, straight, with weariness and contempt. "It's part of the parade," she answered quietly, almost in a whisper. "I got permission." Rick no longer heard, didn't want to hear. For him, this was insubordination. He knew he had to restore order. In fact, he was just looking for a reason to act, and he got it. He stepped forward, with a sharp movement, extended his hand and hit the horse in the muzzle with the back of his hand. The sound was sharp, like a gunshot. The horse squealed, reared. Mabel almost fell. The girls screamed. The crowd exploded. And at that moment, something began that no one was ready for. Not the organizers, not the guards, not even Mabel herself. Because what happened next was no longer an incident. It was a revelation. And the thunder that had long been gathering over the city finally struck. Under the skin of the city, under the dusty skin of the houses, under the licked asphalt where marches had walked and blood had been spilled, memory flowed. It did not die. It was not forgotten. It was simply silent. But those who lived long enough, who carried generations of pain on their shoulders, knew that memory can wait. Mabel James did not simply ride a horse. She swam. Each movement had been calibrated over the years. Her back remained straight, even when her knees were breaking under arthritis. The horse beneath her, an old gelding named Jonesy, walked confidently, as if he sensed the solemnity of the moment. He was not a decorative animal for a photo op. He was a comrade in arms. In the 60s, they walked side by side when a mob of white police cleared the way with clubs and tear gas. He knew the smell of panic. And he knew Mabel's voice, quiet but unbending. The crowd parted, and not out of politeness. There was no challenge in her gaze. There was a reminder. There was a reproach in her posture. The tragedy of the ages was in her every breath. People looked away, as if they were afraid she would say, "I remember how you looked the other way then, and you do it again today." She wasn't trying to make a scene. She was simply present. That was enough to make her dangerous. As she rode into the square, several white volunteers with organizer badges tensed. A young woman with a microphone leaned toward a colleague and whispered, "Who let her in? We don't have a parade section with horses. It's not approved." "That's Mabel James," the man next to her muttered, turning pale. "She has permission from the council. Written, archived, old, but still valid. Who cares? Are we going to look like some kind of Southern March? Is she going to have flags? With the kids, it could be politics. We're celebrating." As the white organizers conferred, trying to find a way to gently remove the symbol they had spent years promoting on their banners as an icon of the struggle, the crowd around Mabel grew denser. People, especially the elderly, leaned closer. Some looked down, others held up their phones. To some, she was a hero. To others, a reminder of guilt they didn't want to admit. Rick was in the latter category. He'd seen her like that before, when he'd served overseas. Women who looked right through you, like you were the dust beneath their boots. Not out of malice, but out of knowledge. You came with a club, but you've already lost, because you don't have what she has. Roots. He hated it. He hated the way she looked at him, like she knew him better than he did. Like everything he did was already written in some old, worn-out book. He could feel the tension boiling under his skin. He had volunteered to guard this festival because he knew how many people would be there. Because he knew how easy it was to rile them up. He believed in discipline. And in this woman's eyes, Discipline was a synonym for enslavement. When he hit the horse, it was more than just an act of force. It was a humiliation, not hers, but an entire generation. He wanted her to be afraid. He wanted her to get off her horse. He wanted to see the crack in her face. But it didn't. Mabel grabbed the reins, stayed in the saddle, sat up straight, and looked at him. There was not fear in her eyes, but something worse, pity, and he was furious. "Get off this instant," he barked, coming closer. "This is not part of the event. You are a security threat." "Am I a threat to you, boy?" she said slowly, keeping her voice low. "Not to me, but to society, yes. You are inciting. You are provoking. I exist. Is that enough to frighten you?" He grabbed the reins. Jonesy jerked. The girls screamed. Mabel checked the horse's movement, but it was too late. The crowd pressed closer. "Hey, get your hands off her!" someone shouted. "What are you doing? That's Grandma!" another shouted. The whole fair, geared up for sweet propaganda of peace and love, was beginning to turn into a battlefield. One man with a camera was trying to get closer. Rick was pushed back, but he did not retreat. He knew he was being filmed now. He had to save face. "Take her away," someone said through clenched teeth into the headset. "Take her away, not on camera. Just resolve the issue, softly, without a scene." But it was too late. While the other guards were stamping their feet, hoping that everything would blow over, one of the girls walked up to Rick and tried to get between him and her grandmother. Small, brave. He shoved her with his shoulder. Not hard, but enough to knock her down. Someone screamed. A woman in the crowd rushed toward her. A teenage boy with a phone rushed forward, shouting, "You hit a child! Are you crazy?" The crowd erupted. Someone started throwing plastic bottles. One of the guards pulled out a taser. A melee broke out. People tried to protect Mabel. Rick stood there, his fists clenched, his face burning with rage. And then, through the screams and chaos, a voice rang out, loud, clear, without a microphone, but audible to everyone. "Rick, get away, now." It was Christina McVeigh, the deputy mayor, pale and nervous, in an expensive pantsuit. She walked through the crowd as if it were raging water. Everyone backed away. "You're fired, right now, in front of this crowd. Take off your badge. Give me your uniform." He froze, his eyes darting around. He knew her power was real, but he couldn't believe it was over. "You want them to win?" he hissed. "Are you playing along?" "I'm saving your skin, while I still can. Do as I'm told, or you'll be carried away." He tore off his vest and threw it to the ground. The crowd applauded. But it wasn't a clap of gratitude. It was a roar of triumph, a collective gasp. Someone shouted, "That's it! Shame! Get out!" Rick walked away, pushing through the crowd, drenched in anger and humiliation. The cameras kept rolling. His face was a meme before he even crossed the street. And Mabel stayed where she was. The horse was shaking, but it stood. The girls were holding onto her dress. She was silent. Not out of fear, out of exhaustion, as if she had said everything with her eyes. But in that moment she realized this was not the end. This was only the beginning, because humiliation does not disappear into thin air. It turns into revenge, in a shadow that grows. And she felt that this story was just beginning to unfold, and it would cost more than everyone thought. The crowd was reflected in Jonesy's eyes, but all of America was in Mabel's eyes. Let's take a short break. Write in the comments where you listen to our stories from. Have you or your loved ones had similar experiences? Situations related to injustice, humiliation, or the fight for dignity? It is important for us to hear your stories. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the continuation. And we continue. His name was Rick Hudson. He was 32. A strong, sharp-featured man with eyes that never held warmth. He stood as if he were rooted to the ground, straight, precise, perfect. But there was anger in that stillness, wound tightly inside, like a spring in a watch that was about to break. Rick was a security guard, but that was not how he put it. "I am order." And he said the word with emphasis, like a sentence. He was born in a small town south of Mobile, Alabama, where time seemed to stand still. There, white people still sat on porches with guns, and black people still stood in line for justice that never came. There was no talk of equality in his family. His father, a Vietnam veteran, spoke to him forcefully. "You are white. Don't forget who built this country here." His mother said, "Watch your back when you're around them. You can't trust them. They ruin everything." Dinner at the table was like a military briefing. News, politics, guns, fear. Fear of losing power, of a new time. Rick absorbed it like dry earth absorbs gasoline. Not right away, but deeply. He was no fool. He knew he had to watch his words, pretend that everything is fine. He learned to smile when his superiors talked about diversity. He knew when to nod, when to remain silent. But inside, everything was seething. He believed that his generation had been betrayed, that the real America was leaving, that it was being supplanted by those who didn't deserve it. And if as a child he simply watched his father turn off the TV when black reporters appeared, then as an adult he already knew what he would do himself. Control. Hold the line. Keep them out. He joined the army, not out of patriotism, but to gain a skill, to learn how to hold a gun, to command, to control a crowd. He was taught to act quickly, without questions, and he learned this. Doubt is for the weak. Rethinking is for losers. When he came back, he got a job in private security, without a uniform, without pomp, but with a license that gave him a sense of power. He loved the feeling that he could tell someone, "You shouldn't be here," and they would leave. He didn't end up at the festival by accident. Rick volunteered as soon as he learned that the event would be held in the historic district, where black families still lived poorly but proudly, where every corner reminded him of marches, protests, old houses, peeling but alive. He hated this district. He hated these faces. Their smiles seemed fake to him. Their dignity was offensive. Inside, he felt that they needed a reminder. You are not the masters here. In the morning, he put on his uniform with special care. He checked his belt, his taser, his rubber baton. He felt like a knight before a battle. On his face, icy calm. Inside, a burning anticipation. He knew there would be a moment. It always happens. Someone would cross the line. Someone would think they were allowed too much. And then, order would be restored. On the spot, Rick kept to himself. He did not engage in conversations with the other guards. They were younger, less experienced, too friendly. Some even laughed with children, helped the elderly, carried water. To him, it seemed weak. A pathetic attempt to please those who would never forgive you simply for the color of your skin. He watched the crowd like a hunter, scanned faces, movements, glances. Saw an old man with a cane linger a little longer near a white tent, noted. Saw a young black couple laughing next to a police car, noted. Saw teenagers in hoodies filming, noted. In every movement, he looked not for chance, but for a challenge, as if he himself prayed for someone to abandon him. When the sound of horseshoes began, he was already tense. It took him a moment to realize what was happening, but as soon as he saw the woman on the horse, his breathing slowed. It was too much. He knew who she was. Everyone knew. Mabel James, a name that was mentioned in the newspapers, in the local schools. The fighter, the voice of a generation. But to him, she was the face of the old world that did not want to die. And that was what made him angry. Why didn't they disappear? Why did they still think they had the right to speak? He felt his fist clench. She was looking not at him, but through him, as if she knew he would be here, as if she were reading him. It was unbearable. As he walked toward her, everything inside him sang with tension. He was not just walking, he was administering his own personal justice. He could already hear the words of his superiors in his head. "You have exceeded your authority, Rick." But he could also hear his own answer. "I prevented chaos." Because to him, her existence was already chaos. He hit the horse because he couldn't hit it. He did it roughly, quickly, the way he'd been trained. He wanted it to flinch, to fall, to break the veil of pride, to scare the children, to let the crowd know there's order here. But order never came. Silence came. The kind of silence that's louder than any scream. Then a storm. And there he was. Not as a hero, but as the face of fury. As a symbol of everything people feared and despised. When Christine McVeigh came out and publicly fired him, he wanted to laugh. He saw it through her eyes, a liberal hypocrite, now hiding behind a camera, disowning one of her own to appease a crowd. He tore off his uniform, not because he repented, but because it was his dare. "You think you've won," he whispered, already walking away. "But I'll be back, in a different uniform, in a different place, because you don't change. And I am part of those who are waiting." And there was fear in this, because he was not lying. He is not alone. And if today he was expelled, tomorrow there will be more like him. Not in uniform, not with a baton, but with a tie, with a microphone, with a mandate, and perhaps with a new form of order, one that looks beautiful, but slowly suffocates. And he left, and the wind over the fair grew colder. The moment their eyes first met was like a sudden, silent shot in the air. It was like a moment that could have been a harbinger of how everything built on lies would crumble in an instant. It was a brief moment, but it left a mark that nothing could wash away. Rick stood still, his eyes fixed on her. He was not ready, but he saw her. She was far away, and even in the shadow of the old tree where her horse stood, she glowed. Mabel James, an old woman, black, stubborn, unwavering. He saw her take the reins gracefully, and her eyes, without looking in his direction, followed his every move. He felt her, as if her gaze were piercing him into his very soul, and he suddenly realized that in that moment, he was losing control. This was not the old woman he was used to seeing in photographs in old newspapers. This was not someone whose monuments, like her name, graced the pages of history books to remind people of times gone by. This woman was not just a symbol. She was a living being, with her own grief, her own history, her own unspoken protest, with which she walked this earth, despite its bitter traces. And in her eyes he saw his own shame, that he himself had once been what she had always been to him. His fingers tightened on the club as he felt his face begin to burn. Why was she looking at him like that, with some kind of challenge, with some kind of silent reproach? He saw in her eyes that she knew what would happen next. She was not afraid of him. She was not afraid of what he might do. She knew that she was the reason why he was here. She was living testimony to all those damned years when people like him could sit quietly in their homes, not realizing that their every look and every word was a weapon. Rick took a step forward, gritting his teeth. He could have simply walked up to her and, as he had been trained to do in the gym, used force, exerted authority. But something stopped him. It wasn't fear. He wasn't afraid of the old woman. It was something more subtle, something in the silent conflict between them that seeped into his blood like a hidden poison, making his heart beat faster. It was her silence. It was her dignity, so implacable that it was an invisible wall he couldn't penetrate. She didn't say a word, didn't try to attack, but her look said more than anything he could have said. He felt that his power was not his own. He wasn't stupid. He knew that people like her were trained to survive in spite of fear. He knew that they had this strength, the strength to resist, not so much physical violence as mental violence. He saw it in every old face, in every step of these people who didn't seem to know what surrender was. But here, in this place, he was the guard. He was the one who stood guard over the order, and despite everything he felt, he couldn't give in to weakness. As he came closer, he felt her assessing him, as if checking him against what was written in her memories of people like him. He was one of those who wore the uniform that had too often become a symbol of oppression, violence, and intimidation. She didn't say a word, but her silence was loud, like a challenge. "This is a private event," Rick said, his tone cold and dry. "You need to leave the site." His voice was emotionless, but his words cut the air like a knife, trying to take control of this situation, to impose his order. He expected her to dismount, to give in. He even hoped that she would come down, because he didn't want to do what he was ordered to do, hit her, humiliate her. He wasn't sure he could not do it, but he didn't expect her to just look at him. Her gaze was direct, like lightning. He saw her eyes meet his, and something inside him instantly contracted. It was like confronting what he feared most. There was no fear in her gaze. She didn't bow. She didn't look away. She remained standing, as those who had stood thousands of years ago had, fighting for their land, for their right to be themselves, despite all orders, even if behind them there were those who were ready to wipe them off the face of the earth. It was a challenge, the purest challenge. "I'm not leaving," she said, her voice even, calm, but so strong that it seemed it could break through the wall built around his mind. "I'm here because I have the right to be here. I will not run away, and I won't hide from you, boy. If you want me to go, you'll have to make me. But know this, I won't go without a fight." He felt his fingers tighten around the club. He didn't want to do this, but she missed what she had said. Her words cut him like a knife. She wasn't afraid of him. She who should have been afraid wasn't afraid of him. She thought of him as nothing, and there was an unbearable humiliation in that. Not for her, for him. Her words were the last straw that tore him from the tenacious bonds with which he had limited himself. But the moment his hand jerked toward her, as if in response to her defiant gaze, he felt the air around him tighten. He didn't know whether it was her strength of spirit or her silent defiance, but he knew that they were both part of that long, inevitable history that could not be erased. Stories where he was the one who had to put down, and she was the one who had been ready to fight for years. There was no anger in her gaze. He didn't see any rage in it. It was a gaze that simply said, "I know who you are. I know you came here to put us down, to remind us who is and is not in this world. But you will not win, not today." In that moment, he felt everything inside him begin to crumble. Mabel James had never been a woman who sought out conflict. She didn't need approval. She didn't crave attention. But her life had been full of brutal confrontations with the system, and each one had left a deep mark on her heart. But today was different. Today, she just wanted to be a part of it. She hadn't come here to fight, but to remind herself and everyone around her that despite everything that had happened, she was still here. She was still alive, and her voice mattered. Mabel didn't notice how her steps on the old horse took her further and further from the main square, where the main festivities were supposed to take place. She was absorbed in memories that came alive in her mind like old photographs, bright and clear, but in which the fog of the past was still felt. She rode among the crowd, trying not to attract attention to herself, but her presence in itself was a challenge. Each of her steps reminded her of the struggle, of what she had gone through, of what she had to go through just to sit here, in this position. And despite her age, despite her weakness, she was living proof that the past had not disappeared, but continued to live in her eyes. But at some point, something went wrong. The horse she was riding, by inertia, deviated from the established route, turning to the side. Perhaps it was an impulse. Perhaps she hadn't noticed how she had left the main road. But the moment her horse was outside the fenced area, it became clear. This was a provocation. Not her mistake. Not her desire. But the system, and the people behind this system, couldn't ignore it. It was at that moment that Rick, standing at the edge, felt his gaze fixate on Mabel. He had been watching her for some time, but this was more. Something inside his head seemed to spin, and he knew. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. Every step, every movement Mabel made on her horse was like a step against his pride, against his convictions. He couldn't let this go on. This was the moment when she stepped out of line, and he had to do something. He took the first step, and immediately he felt the crowd behind him freeze. He knew the camera was filming. He knew someone would be watching, but there was no longer any doubt in his eyes. He could feel the blood starting to pound in his temples, his hand tightening on his baton, his body tensing. Everything was building up inside him, like a storm front. "Get back on track," he said loudly, and with every word you could feel his cold, hard voice that would take no argument. Now. Mabel, feeling a little disconcerted, slowed down and looked at him. She didn't answer right away. She knew this was a tenuous situation, that it was more than a mistake, that she was the center of something bigger than just her own movement. But she wasn't going to walk away, wasn't going to submit. She looked at him, at his stern face, and her eyes reflected the same look that had been constant throughout her life. A look of pain and detachment. A look that was familiar to anyone who had ever encountered a system that tried to silence them. "I'm not going to go back anywhere." Her voice was clear, direct, despite her age and fatigue. "I'm just driving." He took another step forward, unable to contain the anger that was rising inside him with every word she said. How could she speak so calmly? How could she be so defiant, so calm, looking at him like he was nothing? He, who was the guardian of order, who was part of the system that kept this world going. How could she, a black woman, look at him with such disdain, like he was empty and worthless? "You don't know what I'm talking about. You're breaking the rules." His words were sharp, like a blow. "This isn't your place. Go back to where you belong." She didn't move. She wasn't going to back down. Not this time. She felt her heart beat steadily, but somewhere along the way, another wave appeared in her soul. A flash of pain. Not from the threats, not from the words, but from the way he looked at her. It was more than just disrespect. It was humiliation. Deliberate humiliation. It was a fight, but she already knew that she was not just fighting for her place. She was fighting for her truth, her story, her life. "You may think that this is all I deserve," she said slowly. With each word she realized that she needed to speak. She couldn't stay silent. She couldn't let him leave her in the shadows. "You think I should come back because you said so? That I should just get scared and disappear? But you're wrong." Her words cut him like a blade. In that moment, he felt his entire inner world crumble. This wasn't just a fight for space. It was a battle for something more. He couldn't understand it. He couldn't accept it. And the thought made him mad. People began to gather around them. Some began filming her. Some began filming him. Cell phones pointed at them both. The gazes of the onlookers grew more and more wary. The crowd was quietly heating up, like a spiral. The camera that had already begun to record their conversation was capturing every word, every movement, and Rick felt the air grow heavy. He knew that his every move would be watched and judged. He felt his patience crumbling. He took a step forward, and in that moment, as his hand tightened on the baton, he realized this was not just a moment of challenge. This was a moment that would decide who would prevail in this situation. And if he gave in, if he backed down, he would lose everything. He would lose respect. He would lose power. "I said get back on track," he said again, his voice firm but panicked. Mabel did not move. She stood straight, something in her eyes that he could not understand. It was not intimidation. It was power. Power that did not require power. She looked at him as if she knew that her mere presence had already won. At that moment, the crowd around their stage began to slowly move, and the cameras began to record every frame. Something clicked inside Rick, and he realized that all he had to do was not just kick her out. He had to conquer her pride, but now everything was much more complicated than he could have imagined. And now, this moment, this crisis, was the beginning of something much bigger, something he could not have foreseen. Let's take a short break. Write in the comments where you listened to our stories from, and if there was a moment in your life that resembled what you just read. We really appreciate your thoughts and impressions. If you like what we do, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the rest. And now, on to the next one. The moment Rick raised his hand, everyone around him froze. All you could hear was the distant hum of people. But in his mind, everything was compressed, like a spring. His gaze was fixed on Mabel, and in her eyes he read not fear, but defiance. Her back was straight, as it always had been, despite the years. She stood motionless, a figure on a pedestal, ready for battle. But her presence was more than a symbol of fortitude. It was a silent accusation. Everything Rick had ever known was now at risk. He felt something inside him shift, his world crumbling. This wasn't just a black woman on a horse. This was a woman who carried within her an entire history of fear and pain. She was part of the very past that had been hidden for so long, and that he, like so many others, wanted to forget. He didn't want to think about what she represented. He wanted only to think about how to put everything back together, and now he was going to do it. He took a step, and without waiting for her answer, without giving her a chance to say anything else, his hand shot into the air. Rick couldn't explain what had pushed him. He didn't want to think about it. He acted on instinct. His fingers tightened around the club, and he practically yanked it toward him. Deadly determination. In that moment, he was sure he was right. This was his moment. He had to restore order, and her pride, her fortitude, all of it stood in his way. When the club struck the horse with a terrible sound, the air around him shook. The horse jerked, its head jerking up, its body suddenly panicked, and it lurched forward. Mabel barely managed to catch herself as the animal howled and reared. Everything around her froze for a moment. Time seemed to stand still. She grabbed the reins, her body tensed, but you could see how she barely kept her balance. The crowd froze. No one moved. They stared in horror, trying to comprehend what had just happened. Their eyes were wide, as if they couldn't believe what they were seeing. How could this happen? How could a guard hit a horse? Mabel, who had always been a symbol of dignity and strength, was now on the verge of falling, and it was all happening before their eyes. And at that moment, when the horse reared up and Mabel almost lost her balance, a wild, inhuman scream rang out. It was not a scream of pain, but a scream of fear. A scream that burst from the chest of a little girl standing in the crowd and instantly spread across the square. There was so much horror in her voice that it seemed like the entire crowd was shaking. She screamed without understanding what had happened, without realizing that her scream had just become an echo of the invisible violence that was part of their history. And at that moment, when the adrenaline was overflowing Rick, when his eyes were clouded with rage, he heard a sound that almost made him stop. It was the sound of a camera clicking. People started filming. Those who stood in the front rows did not miss the chance to capture this moment on their phones. They didn't know what it was coming, but they knew it was happening right before their eyes, and they had to capture it. This was a momentous occasion. This was something that couldn't be forgotten. Rick felt the moment slipping away from him. He could feel his actions being recorded on the screen, and he already knew. This wasn't just a violation. This wasn't just restoring order. This was more. This was his own humiliation, and now it was recorded. Every frame was his shame, his loss of control, his failure. But what was worse was that he felt like this was all that would be left of him. All that footage, all that video, they would be etched in people's memories forever. Not as an act, but as a failure. Mabel held the reins as before, but her face was pale. She sat up straight, regaining control, but her eyes were closed with pain. This moment wasn't just a blow to her horse. It was a blow to her dignity. It was her right to be here, on this earth, among people who looked at her and saw her only through the lens of the pain she had endured. That blow was a reminder that she would never be free. There would always be someone who would deem her out of place. Rick stood there, unable to move. He felt his hands shaking. He didn't know what to do. He knew that nothing would fix this moment. He knew that now everyone would see him for who he really was. He was not the guardian of order, not the one who was supposed to keep the peace. He was the one who broke the system. He was the one who used force against those who should never have experienced it. The crowd began to seethe. People were shouting curses, screaming words, but there was something more in their voices than just anger. It was a cry for justice that had finally broken through the wall of silence. Some tried to get to Mabel, to help her, to support her. The others were still standing there in shock, unsure of what to say. But in that moment, as if someone had turned off a light, Rick realized that his actions weren't just a violation. This was the point of no return. As Rick retreated, the crowd quickly began to turn on him. Someone in the crowd grabbed their phone and filmed his face again, trying to capture this moment, a moment that was full of racism, full of violence. Mabel didn't fall, but her eyes were full of pain and loss. She looked back at the guard, and there was not only contempt in her gaze, but something deeper, the understanding that she would never be free of this world, of these people, and even if she lived for many more years, her every move would always be under scrutiny, under threat. This was not just a crime against her. It was a crime against her generation. It was a crime against everything she had lived through, everything her family had lived through. And now it was written down. It was proven. And despite the fear, despite the pain, she knew she would not give in. She looked at him, and there was no challenge in her eyes. It was simply a question she did not expect an answer to. How much longer? Events unfolded quickly, like a storm, growing stronger with each passing moment, drawing in more and more people. The sound of the blow to the horse was an echo, a repercussion of years of silence that was about to explode. Everything was happening right in front of the crowd, and the people standing around could not simply watch without interfering. This was more than just an incident at a festival. This was a clash of worldviews, histories, past and present grievances that could not be forgotten. As Rick stepped back, his gaze darted around the crowd, but he already knew. He had become the center of their anger. People were starting to move toward him like a torrent of water, trying to destroy everything in its path. He tried to take a step back, but he found himself surrounded. The guard, accustomed to power, to being at the center of events and in control, now found himself trapped. This was not just discontent. This was a volcano of emotion that seemed ready to tear apart the space around him. The crowd was noisy, but there was no chaos. This was anger dictated by years of humiliation, by the systemic racism that continued to poison the lives of the people standing here. There was something in their eyes that no external attribute could hide. Not the guard's badge, not his uniform, not his gestures. It was the look of someone who finally understood that the moment had come to pay for years of silence, for years of oppression, for everything hidden under the mask of order. Now that order was crumbling, and Rick had become its symbol. "Are you out of your mind?" a man in the crowd shouted, pushing forward. His voice was low but full of fury. "You hit an old woman, are you nuts?" Rick tried to respond, but the words wouldn't come. His mouth was a frozen wound. He didn't know what to say. He could have defended himself. He could have said it was an incident, that he was following instructions. But it all seemed hollow and false when he saw the way people looked at him. This wasn't just an accusation of violence. It was an accusation of racism, of using force on those who shouldn't have it, of the idea that he was the one who was supposed to be in control not just of order, but of reality itself. "You're the racist, you freak! Did you come here to humiliate us? Do you think we'll forget how you hit a woman?" Another man shouted, clenching his fists. His voice was full of pain and righteous anger. The people around him began to repeat his words, every second one looking at Rick as if he were the enemy, as if he were a symbol of everything that was bothering them. The racism wasn't just in the action. It was in every look, every crooked smile, every show of power with which Rick and his colleagues looked at people they considered out of place. The crowd was gradually closing in on him. Some of the men in the front rows were already pushing Rick, and he felt his feet slipping on the dirty asphalt. He tried to find a place for himself, but he was surrounded. He was trapped. It seemed like every voice, every word, was a time bomb waiting to go off. At one point, someone in the crowd came so close that Rick felt the cold air penetrate his face, the air become damp with aggression. His breathing was heavy, his eyes darted around, looking for an exit, but his body did not move. He stood as if expecting a blow, as if he knew that this would not end so easily. He still didn't understand what was happening, but the feeling that something was wrong was so strong that it filled him completely. "Get out of here before I break your legs!" another man shouted, now clutching a rock in his hands. Rick saw him up close, his eyes full of determination, full of fury. And this fury was like something old, long forgotten, but not gone, like some bloody memory. An internal scream sounded in his head. This was not just an attack on him. This was an attack on everything he considered his, on his idea of order, on his morality, on his perception of right and wrong. This was the moment when his confidence in his own rightness began to fade. He felt his own body not responding, his hands starting to shake, the blood receding from his head. "You are a racist! You disrespected us!" came another scream, this time from a woman who stood next to the man with the rock. Her eyes were blazing, her voice was determined, and there was so much pain in it, so much historical pain that Rick knew he could not be defeated by words alone. He was part of a system that did more than keep people on their knees. It mocked them, and in that moment, when he was surrounded, he knew that none of this was an accident. All of this was his part in that system. Mabel stood a little to the side, holding on to her horse. She could not help but see what was happening around her, but her face was calm as always. There was no fury in her eyes, no malice. But there was something else, something deep that the onlookers could not understand until they saw her look. She knew they would not stop. She knew this was more than an incident. It was more. It was the consequence of all the history she had lived through, and which she would never be allowed to forget. Rick tried to back away, but the crowd did not let him. Everything around him was like a scream, like a wave washing over him from head to toe. His body was tense, but he knew that if he took a step back, he would be defeated. He felt his chest tighten, his breathing become ragged. He was on the edge. Then, as if on cue, several people rushed to Mabel. They went to her horse to support her, to help her regain her balance. Someone silently touched her hand. Someone said something soothing. But all this happened against the backdrop of a general scene that was no longer just a protest, but a symbol of the fact that their patience had come to an end. The crowd continued to shout, and Rick realized that he had lost control. He was not just a guard, not just a man doing his job. He was part of history that he could not change. And now that he saw it all, he understood. He was more than just a man with a club. He was a symbol of a system that was doomed to fail. Just when the crowd around Rick was beginning to lose all control, a woman suddenly appeared in the square. She walked quickly, almost running, with confident steps, as if she knew exactly what was coming. Her appearance was so sudden that everyone froze for a moment, as if they themselves did not understand what was happening. She was white, middle-aged, with a perfectly tailored suit, severe, but at the same time elegant, reflecting her status in this society. Her high heels clicked on the asphalt, and she did not slow down, as if not noticing the noise around her. Her face was covered with a mask of professionalism, but behind that mask, there was concern. This was Christina McVeigh, the deputy organizer of the festival, the person whose job it was to keep the situation under control, so that nothing could disturb the perfect facade of their event. She was at the center of everything that was happening, even if she remained behind the scenes. But now the situation was out of control, and she knew that she was the one who would have to decide how it would end. As soon as her gaze fell on Rick, and then on Mabel, her face changed slightly. You could see it all fall into place right in her eyes. She wasn't stupid or naive. She knew full well that this wasn't just an incident. It was something much more serious. She knew that those who stood in the front lines, like Rick, could always be the catalyst for something much bigger. She knew that Mabel and her legacy were more than just a grandmother coming to a festival. This was the face of a protest, the face of a long struggle that could cause a storm if left unchecked. Christina walked up to the crowd, which had now tightly surrounded the security guard. People were shouting, hurling accusations. Rick stood, clutching his baton, but his body was tense as a string. He knew that all these people were looking at him now, as the embodiment of all the injustice that had been ingrained in their lives. He was a white man, part of a system that had encouraged discrimination since the moment he was born, creating the division that was now so obvious. "Get him out of here," Christina said calmly, but her voice was firm and decisive. She ignored the crowd's protests, didn't think about the consequences. She made her decision immediately. The crowd fell silent for a moment, as if her very figure had made them stop. She was part of the system, but she knew how to manipulate it. She knew she had everything she needed to take control of the situation. Her connections, her resources, her status. She was not a political activist and did not like to discuss the difficulties of minorities. But she knew one thing. If the situation got out of hand, her career, no matter how hard she tried to appear on the side of everyone, would be in jeopardy. So her first move was swift and precise. Christina walked up to Rick, but did not look him in the eye. She avoided his gaze, knowing that her calm was the key. There was a challenge in her eyes, but hidden behind a mask of refined diplomacy. She felt that her every move would be closely watched, like an old film frame where each actor carries his role. Rick was, in essence, her subordinate, but now her decision brought him to his knees. "You're fired," she said bluntly, her words cutting through space illuminated by an ominous light. Rick could not believe his ears. He was in shock. He hadn't expected it to happen so quickly. He couldn't believe that all his behavior, all his confidence, all his actions could lead to this moment. But now he saw the people around him start whispering. This was the moment when his position in this system, in this project, suddenly became so fragile that he didn't know how to react. "Get him off the court," Christina continued, ignoring his face. She wasn't trying to find pity in him, wasn't looking for excuses for his behavior. She had accepted her role and was now playing it to the end. There was a slight note of contempt in her voice, barely noticeable, but enough for everyone to hear. The crowd began to applaud. It was a strange feeling, as if each person felt satisfaction that the system was winning again, that someone had taken the path of justice. They looked at Rick as if he were a criminal who had been punished as he deserved. There was more than just revenge in their eyes. There was liberation. It was a release from the heavy, painful shadow that his figure symbolized. But Rick didn't leave right away. He stood there, looking at her, as if he had something important to say, something that would justify his actions. But he couldn't. All he felt was self-pity. He couldn't believe he was in this situation. He couldn't believe he was so vulnerable. All that remained was a sickening feeling of powerlessness. Christine turned around, not expecting him to say anything. She seemed to have already made up her mind for everyone. She knew she had done the right thing, but she couldn't help but feel how her own role in this encounter put her in a whole new context. She was part of a system, and now the system had won again. But had it really won? The crowd continued to whisper and discuss what had happened, some people glancing at Mabel, who had stood motionless the whole time, watching everything happen. There was no hatred in her eyes, no contempt. She was simply watching. She knew that much depended on how society would perceive this moment. She knew that her existence and her struggle were part of a larger process, a process that did not end on one stage. But for Rick, at this moment, it was his personal catastrophe. It was the moment when his world, his image of the world as a white man who had always been on the side of order, was destroyed. And now, when he retreated, when he lost his job, his face was red with shame and humiliation. Christina, watching this, felt an internal conflict. She was part of this system. But for a moment, it seemed to her that she was playing a game in which everyone had long forgotten what was important. She had made a decision, but despite her determination, she knew that the consequences would be long-term. After all, in her hands were not only the levers of power, but also the weight of what was happening, what had been happening for many years. A shadow appeared in her eyes more and more. Let's take a short break. Write in the comments where you listen to our stories from, and whether there was a moment in your life that in some way resembles what is happening. We are always happy to hear your thoughts and experiences. If you like what we do, do not forget to subscribe so as not to miss the continuation. And now we continue. The crowd began to calm down a little, but the tension in the air was still hanging. People stood in anticipation, silently, carefully watching every movement that took place in the square. This was the moment when history was not simply superimposed on personal destinies. It became a living witness to what was happening in every house, in every family, in every glance directed at the security guard. Christina McVeigh, the deputy organizer of the festival, turned to Rick, who was still standing, clutching his baton, his face red with shame and rage. He clearly did not expect her decision to be so quick and ruthless. She stood in front of him, and her figure seemed unyielding, like a stone wall. "You're fired," she said loudly, so that her words carried to the very back of the crowd. This was not just a formality. This was a public demonstration. She was not going to do this in the shadows. She was not going to discuss this behind closed doors. This had to happen in front of everyone, right here, right now, in this place, where racism and violence seemed to have long been hidden under verbal embellishments, and this moment tore them apart, leaving no room for excuses. Her voice was hard, stern, almost cold. There was no pity in it. There was no sympathy. This was a show of force. Force that was supposed to prove that the system still stood. A system in which she, as part of the norm, had the right to decide who deserved to rise to the occasion and who should be humiliated. And now, right in front of the crowd, Rick was the one who was falling. He was not simply fired, he was publicly destroyed. "You betrayed your place," she continued, her voice growing louder. "You broke the rules that we are all required to follow. But your behavior is not only unacceptable, it is shameful to all of us, to our entire community. Not only did you use violence against a peaceful person, you used your position to oppress those who were already oppressed." The crowd began to fill with sounds, some applause, some shouts of approval. It was as if the moment itself was predictable, as if everyone knew it was coming, but did not know how much it would hurt. But there was no joy in the applause. This was a moment of satisfaction. It was like a play where an actor, once he stepped onto the stage, could not return to the shadows. This moment was the brutal reality for Rick that his place in this world was not just that of a security guard. It was a place where he did not belong. She did not slow her steps. Her words continued to sound like hammer blows. Every gesture she made was filled with a commanding confidence. She stood there as the one with the power to decide, and her decision was public. He was no longer part of this celebration, this sham of unity. He had been cast outside it. People like you continue to fuel the fires of hatred and violence. We can't have people like you in our ranks. We can't have people like you pretending that order is important when in reality, you're just encouraging oppression and racism. This has to end. You're fired, and you're not coming back. Rick stood like a rock, but his face was tight, as if his own identity, his own beliefs were being torn apart. He tried to find the words, but all he could do was stare at her with disdain. He couldn't find the strength to respond. His body felt paralyzed. He stood there, but his entire being screamed with rage. How could she do this in front of everyone? How could she humiliate him so publicly? How could she so easily, so without hesitation, take away not only his job, but the status he thought he deserved? But it was all a lie. He was part of this system, a system that not only protected those at the top, but also gave them the power to destroy those at the bottom. Everything he knew made no sense. He was just a pawn in a game where the players at the table never noticed those at the bottom. The crowd exploded with emotion. With every word she said, people felt the pressure on their souls begin to recede. They applauded, they cheered, because it was so necessary. They had waited so long for this moment. But amidst the tumultuous reaction, there was something else, something deeper, something they couldn't understand. It wasn't satisfaction. It was release. Release from what was holding them back, from what was keeping them in this struggle. Some of the men in the crowd tried to push forward to express their gratitude to Christina. They shouted her name, raised their fists, but others simply stood there, motionless, silent, as if they knew this moment was not the end point. It was just one step on a path that had lasted for centuries. It was the moment when they felt their eyes begin to open, that all this mess, all this struggle, was finally beginning to make sense. Rick, with disgust in his eyes, turned and began to walk away slowly, without looking back. He felt disgraced. He was hurt. But what was worse, he knew that his departure did not end this story. It was only the beginning. He knew that this moment would become part of a story that he could not escape. All he wanted was to forget, but that was not possible. He was now part of something bigger, something he could not control. But as he was almost at the exit, as his figure disappeared from sight, the crowd fell silent for a moment. It was as if everything had suddenly become quiet. But in fact, this was what everyone had been waiting for. This was the moment when they realized that the system was not broken, that this was not the end. This was just a continuation of the struggle, a struggle that would continue until they found true freedom. Christina stood there, alone. She looked out at the crowd again. This was her victory, but her loss too, because even though she had gotten over the incident, she knew that the story didn't end there. Rick had been fired, but that didn't solve the problems that ran deeper. She stood there, looking out into the distance, feeling her face tighten, and she knew that here, in the midst of the applause, she knew that her place was not with the winners, but with those who carried the weight of the past. Rick didn't move. He stood there, feeling his body grow heavy with humiliation. His eyes were not blazing with anger, but despair. He could hear the applause, the satisfaction filling the crowd, but he couldn't allow himself to be part of this spectacle. He couldn't let this go on, without speaking out, without escalating the situation. There was a fire in his soul that couldn't be calmed by simple accusations, couldn't be calmed by Christina's words. She could fire him, she could do anything, but she couldn't take his truth away from him. Rick turned around, and there was something in his movements that made even those who were applauding freeze. It was like the last spark before the whole world went up in flames. He turned around, standing in the center of the square, and his voice rang out loud, like a bolt of lightning breaking the silence. "This is all a farce," he shouted, and his words echoed in the air. "You're the ones who made me the scapegoat. You, with your ideas of order, with your hypocritical smiles, with your stupid belief that if you throw me out, you're solving the problem. But in fact, you're hiding the real problem. You think that by destroying me, you will get rid of everything you hate, but you will not change a thing." His eyes darted over the faces in the crowd, and he could feel how the people, those who had recently been applauding, were now frozen. Their looks were no longer full of satisfaction. They had become wary, confused. Rick continued, "You don't understand." His voice was heavy, full of pain, as if he could not remain silent any longer. "Do you think that I am the only one? That I am the only problem that is destroying this world? No, I was just a small part of the system, a part of what you all support. I am just a pawn in your game. I did what I was told because I needed to work, because I needed to live. But you are still the same as me. You are not better. You are not more righteous. You do not fight the system. You support it. All these rules, these holidays, these fake smiles, they are a lie." The crowd began to whisper, some backing away. It was as if his words were a black stain that began to spread across the square, stretching into ever wider circles. Rick felt his body tremble with tension, but there was the same ruthless fire in his eyes. He knew he had said something that many could not say. He knew he had touched more than just Christina, more than just himself. He had touched something much bigger, the very foundation on which this entire world stood. All of you, those who sit on a pedestal, you are all the same. Do you think that if you cast me out, you will be clean? If you remove me, as you have been taught, you will change anything? No, you will simply continue to do what you have always done. You will continue to hide your racial hatred under the guise of unity. Continue to put people in their place. Continue to think that you have the right to judge those who were and always will be beneath you. This is all a system that will win no matter how hard you try to destroy it. His words cut into the crowd like sharp needles that are impossible to pull out. People began to react. Some tried to shout something back at him. Some covered their ears, but no one could completely ignore what he said. There was more to his words than just rage. There was a truth that many could not admit, but which everyone felt. And in that moment, when Rick raised his hand as if in farewell, he felt his power disappear. But there was nothing more he could do. He knew that he had already said his piece. "So no, Christina." His voice became low, almost caustic. "You did not fire me. You killed me. And you and everyone else who decided that they could just throw me away like an unnecessary thing. But I will not remain silent. I will not leave like you want. I will speak my truth. And when I leave here, I will know one thing. You will all remain as hypocritical as before." With these words, Rick turned and walked away without looking back. But before he disappeared into the crowd, he heard the noise coming from around him. People began to applaud again, but this was a different applause. It was not the same delight as at the beginning. It was a gesture that conveyed not only anger, but also understanding. The people who were standing in the audience, who were filming the video, could no longer simply remain silent. They understood that his words were not just accusations. It was a cry for help, a cry that had not been heard until now. Rick disappeared into the crowd, and his words remained in the air. But they did not disappear. They remained. They began to penetrate the consciousness of those who stood and watched. He was gone, but his truth remained, and they could not brush it off. When Christina returned to the center of the square, her face was a little pale, but she quickly regained her confident appearance. She knew that everything that had happened was just part of the story, and even though she had won that moment, there was no joy in her eyes. She felt her own role in this process starting to blur from within. She could take Rick out, she could humiliate him, but what he had said would not go away. It remained, and it would continue to sound in the minds of everyone in the square. This moment was just the beginning. Let's take a short break. Write in the comments where you listened to our stories from, and if there was a moment in your life that in some way resembled what was happening. We always appreciate your thoughts and experiences. If you like what we do, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the rest. And now, on to the next one. Mabel James stood motionless as the crowd around her gradually grew, like a wave rolling onto the shore. The noise and shouts died down, but inside her, everything was deafeningly loud. She felt every thought, every memory, every feeling that had long been forgotten and sealed away, now surfacing again like clots of blood on white cloth. Her hands were tight on the reins, but their tension was not the same as before. With each passing moment, the weight of the past was more and more noticeable, pressing down on her shoulders. It was not just a physical weight, it was something much deeper, subtle, almost invisible, but as tangible as the air she breathed. She could not shake this feeling, the feeling that everything that had happened to her today was not accidental. It was a sign, a reminder. Her thoughts returned to the past again, and as her horse took another step, as if in time with her memories, she felt the memories filling her, her body finding itself once again on the same marches on which she had stood decades ago. She found herself back among the people who carried the flags that read, "God bless America," who held their hands up, screaming into the sky because there was no other way to express the pain that was piercing her soul. Mabel saw herself in that march, a young woman standing among the people who marched in step, who marched with one intention, the intention of wresting their freedom, wresting it literally and figuratively. There was the same fire in their eyes that she saw now, in the eyes of those who stood in the crowd. But it had been different then. It had been a different time, different causes, different slogans, and it had been just as she had imagined the struggle. The battles they had fought then had been real, physical. They had been part of what her generation called civil rights. But battles never ended. They just changed shape. The images came back to her mind, familiar and painful. The march she was joining was both an act of courage and terror. White police officers in armor stood guard, clubs in hand, ready to strike anyone who did not follow the designated route, standing in the way of freedom, in the way of equality, in the way of justice. Mabel remembered the moment when she, young and determined, raised her hands as she crossed the bridge in Selma. Then her legs had carried her toward truth, but on the bridge she had suddenly felt blows rain down on her body. A cold hand with a club slammed into her shoulder. Her back had bent, but she kept going despite the pain, despite the blood that ran down her legs. These memories had become part of her. They had become part of her DNA, part of her world, and she knew that this moment she was experiencing today was not just an accident. Everything was happening again. Everything was coming back, but in a different form. The horse she was now sitting on was a victim, just like her, all those years ago. And this attack on her animal was like an echo of the same cruelty that had haunted her throughout her life. The crowd continued to shout and applaud, but she did not hear them. She saw only one picture that was playing in her head. A picture of herself, already a grown woman, walking across that very bridge, and around her again stood the same people, with clubs in their hands, with the same eyes full of contempt. And no matter how much she tried to hide that look, no matter how much she tried to cover it with her hands, it was always there, in her eyes, in her soul. She did not notice how her face became tense. She did not notice how her heart quickened its rhythm. She was there again, in that time, in that struggle, in those painful memories. Those wounds never healed. They were simply hidden under layers of pain and time, but they did not disappear. As she became aware of standing here again, in the present, she felt something change. How this place, this festival, this celebration, was really just another facade. Everything was the same, just in a different guise. She came back to the present. She remembered holding the reins, how the horse beneath her had twitched slightly. This moment had not been a mere incident. It had been a moment that had opened old wounds. It had been a moment that had made her realize that this entire system, this entire behavior, everything that had been happening around her was really the same thing, just packaged in a new form. The new form was far more dangerous. It was not overt violence. It was a subtle, sophisticated form of racism. It was the use of power not to protect the weak, but to dominate them, to humiliate them. And while she saw these subtle attempts to explain her situation as part of a peaceful unity, she knew that these covers could not hide what was really happening. It was all part of a system that kept running, kept oppressing, kept undermining any attempt at change. Mabel felt her eyes fill with tears. It wasn't fear. It wasn't pain. It was the realization that everything she'd endured, everything she'd fought for, was coming out again, in different forms, but with the same faces. The faces of those who used force to subjugate, to oppress. The horse began to walk again. She could feel its confident steps, but also its shaking, its restlessness. It was all connected. These wounds, these memories. It was a cycle that seemed to have no end. She sighed, looking around. All these people standing and watching now, these faces. They didn't know. They couldn't know that they were part of something so much bigger, something they couldn't see from behind the curtain of their own privilege. But she knew. She knew it was just a moment, a small episode in a long story. But still, in her heart, there was a feeling that at least a small step had been taken. At least some truth had come out. Those looks, those words, they could not be forgotten. And no matter how they tried to suppress it, no matter how they tried to hide it, it would live. It would sound in every battle, in every step, in every memory. Mabel sat in the saddle, holding the reins tightly, and felt how her horse, standing on the border of the past and the present, took another step into the future. At the edge of the square, in the middle of the crowd, at a moment when all attention was riveted to what was happening, there stood a teenager. He held a smartphone in his hands, which he clutched tightly in his hands, and his fingers, trembling with excitement, hesitantly fiddled with the buttons all the time, not letting the camera go out of focus. He was not part of the scene. He was not a participant in this stormy drama, but he was a witness who knew that everything that was happening around him had to be recorded so that people could see the truth. The truth, no matter how hard they tried to hide it, would always find a way out. He started filming when the guard approached Mabel, when he hit the horse, and when she barely managed to stay in place without falling. The teenager saw how she held back, how her eyes said so much that was not said out loud. He felt that this was not just an incident. This was an act of violence that was reproduced over and over again, always in a new form, but with the same cruel motives. This was not just an exercise in power. It was an attempt to outshine, to humiliate, to show that those who do not obey have no right to be in this place. When Rick was fired, when Christina said these words publicly, the teenager started filming again, understanding that this was a moment that needed to be preserved. He knew that this scene would be discussed, that it would be rewritten. His camera captured not just the action, but the emotion, the crowd's reaction, the noise, the anger, the sense of change that couldn't be stopped. He saw how Christina was trying to sound righteous as she took this step, but there was nothing pure about her actions. He saw how her words were meant not to fix the situation, but to preserve what she saw as order. After Rick left, the teenager continued filming. He recorded the moment the crowd erupted in applause, but there was no joy in that applause. He felt the tension build, the applause become an empty form of approval that was meant to obscure the real pain, the real tragedy unfolding before their eyes. He heard someone say that it's all fair and that the system worked. But this moment was more complex than just right and wrong. Almost as soon as the teenager stopped recording, he posted the video online. He knew it would be viewed by thousands. He was sure that people would see everything that was happening, and they would understand how the system really works, how we all really watch these scenes and remain indifferent because they simply become part of the norm. And as soon as he posted the video, the comments appeared on the screen. People who were not there, people who would never see Mabel, who would never feel what Rick felt in that moment, began to comment. Some said that it was just discipline and that it was all for the sake of order. Some claimed that the woman on the horse was guilty of breaking the rules. Someone even suggested that it was overreaction on the part of the guard, but she was out of place, not on the right level. But among the many comments, among the noise, there was one that overshadowed everything else. It was simple, but so powerful. This is more than just an incident. This is what happens every day to those who do not see the white walls, who cannot buy themselves a place in this world. This is a continuation of the same struggle, and we need to see it, not hide it. The teenager realized that his video had become something bigger. It wasn't just a documented event. It was a moment when something much more important began to shift. It was a window into a reality that many would rather close. But as the camera continued to record, the story took a different turn. At the end, as everyone began to disperse, as Rick left the square and Mabel stood there, feeling like every step she took was taking her deeper into history, there was a scene no one knew about. Backstage, in one of the offices, the event's organizers had gathered to discuss the aftermath. They weren't talking about what had happened as a tragedy. They weren't talking about hostility or racism or the system. They were talking about how to fix what had happened, how to rewrite the moment so that it would look different, so that people could see it without shame. They said the video needed to be softened, as if it were just a random incident rather than a systemic problem. "We can't let this become a talking point," said one organizer, a middle-aged man in a sharp suit. "We're going to show that we took action. We fired the guard, and that should be visible. But no one should see that this was part of something much bigger. We can't let this conversation about racism and violence become the focus. This should look like a mistake, nothing more." The others in the room nodded, agreeing. They discussed how to meticulously sanitize the footage, how to de-emphasize the crowd's reactions, those who were beginning to realize that this was not just a violation, but an act of aggression hidden under the guise of legality. But in that moment, as they tried to correct what had happened and paint a picture that would be convenient for their reputations, the teenager's camera was still online. It would not disappear. It was like a silent witness that could not be hidden. The video could not be rewritten, and no matter how hard they tried to hide the truth, that truth would come out. As the hours passed and the comments continued to pour in, more and more people began to realize that this incident was just the tip of the iceberg. What had at first seemed like a simple moment in a crowd had become a symbol of struggle, a symbol of racism that continues to exist despite all attempts to hide it, despite all attempts to silence it. The teenager sat at the computer and read the comments. He didn't know how the world would change after the video was viewed, but he felt that something in this world would definitely start to change, because people started watching. They started to see what they had previously hidden, and despite all the efforts of the organizers and those who tried to rewrite history, they could not remove the truth that was now visible to everyone. And this was only the beginning. The moment Rick was fired was important not only for him, but for all those who saw how easily the system can swallow the innocent and then discard them if they become inconvenient. But now the story was not just hidden, it became a clear sign of what needed to be changed. We would love to know what you think about this story. Have you ever had moments in your life related to racism or injustice? Your thoughts and experiences are truly very important to us, and we appreciate each and every one of you. Please do not forget to subscribe, like, and support us. Also, write a phrase related to the topic so we know you listened to the end of the story. Have a nice day, and thanks for joining us.